What is going, everybody? Welcome to a very special episode of Fantasy Football Weekly. This is actually a very special night. If you're a Scott Fishbowl fan, what's Scott Fishbowl? We're going to tell you about it. For those of you who do not know, it is a jam-packed Scott Fishbowl night here on Fantasy Football Weekly and on the fantasyinframes draft show. Before we get to that, let's get to this. I believe that is what we call in the biz a tease. I think hopefully that was a decent one. I'm your host, Jorge Edwards. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. With me, we got Kevin Tompkins. Kevin, man, how are you doing, sir?
I am doing much better than I was last week, certainly. I don't want to get too into the weeds with it, but let's just say kidney stones are not fun. So that's about all I will say about that. But otherwise, we are great. Look, Scott Fishbowl season. This is like the time where it's like fantasy football is kicking off for 2024. When you get to Scott Fishbowl scoring, when you get everybody, getting into leagues and talking about the live drafts, and of course the podathon coming up soon. It's so much great stuff. The charity aspect of it, of course. It's really like the tentpole event of the summer, getting these drafts going, getting all the festivities going. I'm excited.
Yeah, no. And so for those of you who are unaware of what Scott Fishbowl is, this is his 14th iteration, first of all, this year. And basically the gist of it is this. There's a guy, a very kind man. We've met him several times, Kevin and I, as well as many out there who've attended the Fantasy Football Expo, which, by the way, tickets are still on sale. You're welcome, Bob Lung, for that little plug there. By the name of Scott Fish, who years ago, 14 in fact, created a tournament, a small tournament that has kind of blown up into this massive tournament where he's pitting, analysts versus analysts, people that he looked up to in the industry for years, just having them take on each other in a fantasy football tournament that was kind of different from the norm, so to speak, and that has blown up into a full-blown 2,000 plus invitee fantasy football tournament, which is generally centered around charity. So one of the things that Scott Fish does a really good job of every year is organizing charities to we got Ann in the chat. What's up, Ann? We should see you next hour on the draft show, which I'll get to in a second here.
Settle in, Ann. We got a lot going on tonight.
And so anyhow, so the gist is that Fantasy Cares, fantasycares.org is who is the organizing body for the charitable aspect of Scott Fishbowl. And Scott Fish has done a great job raising a lot of money each and every year for Toys for Tots, and it's a great tournament. It's a great fantasy football tournament. The rules change for the most part every year. Without a couple things stay the same, but he always tries to make things different. So you kind of have something to look forward to every year. Every year around April or May is when the invites start rolling out via email. And then everybody in the fantasy football space, which is a large majority of it, is on Twitter or X now. Everybody is like, "Oh my god, I got my Scott Fishbowl invite," or they're waiting until drafts start in early July, and it's like, I still haven't gotten an invite. Which, by the way, you're not going to get an invite if you do not go to scottfishbowl.com and register. So make sure you do that first and foremost. But it's so cool seeing everybody's reaction, just like, oh, thank you, Scott Fish. Just thank you, everybody. Thank you, Fantasy Cares, everybody associated with Scott Fishbowl, because everybody doesn't say thank you very much for letting me be a part of this fantasy football tournament. It's thank you for letting me be a part of this charity tournament that just happens to focus on fantasy football. And I think that's probably one of the most humbling aspects of being a part of this fantasy football community. Would you disagree with that, Kevin?
No, everything you hit on was just spot on. I mean, it's so weird to feel like this is my 6th Scott Fishbowl, and it actually coincides completely when I moved to North Dakota, about to participate in my first in 2019. So it's just wild to me that not only that, I mean, it was way before it was Fantasy Football Oasis, and then obviously became the Scott Fishbowl. with that Mike Clay of ESPN being the first winner of the Fantasy Oasis Bowl, which ended up being the Scott Fish Bowl. But yeah, so what makes it great is that, obviously you have the charitable aspect, being able to do so much good for other people who may not be as fortunate as other people. And then, for the fantasy football community, being able to participate in this, these fantasy football leagues, the theme, obviously there's a theme every single year, whether it's, video games, whether it's, different other things. Like this year, it's movies. So, Mighty Ducks, obviously that took place in Minnesota. I will be drafting Minneapolis Live. So the Bash Brothers, that'll be a lot of fun. But yeah, it's just a bunch of different things that gets a lot of people, kind of integrated into everything. And of course, the Podathon is what really galvanizes a lot of things too for people. Really brings awareness to, just how powerful of an entity Fantasy Cares is, and just the immense reach that they have to be able to raise so much money for people. Matthew Berry usually, matches donations to play in his division. I know he's done that the last couple of years, which has been fantastic. And then not every year it's the same. You always have those few wrinkles that, you talked about, Jorge, where not every league is the same. We certainly have that this year, where some things might be the same, but other things, we really got to pay attention to. And people just do deep dives on, fancy websites, across the industry, talking about the Scott Fish Bowl, talking about the scoring, and kind of getting how to get that little edge on everybody else too. When you're talking about how many thousands of people, and we've got 13 winners, gonna have a 14th one this year. It's fantastic. I can't wait to get started in my draft in a few weeks, about a month actually.
Yep, exactly. And speaking a little bit more on the Scott Fish Bowl Podathon, this year it starts July 8th, which I believe is a Saturday at 8 a.m. June. Let me back up here. It starts June 29th at 8 a.m. and runs through June 30th at 8 p.m.
Yep.
Hosted by Sal Lito. And it goes nonstop. These people for Fantasy Cares, for the Podathon, they just basically bring on guests within the fantasy football space, and people are tuning in to this Podathon, whether it's at a primetime location like 8, or in the middle of the afternoon, or even when we were on last year, Fantasy Frames. Remember, we had like a 4:30 a.m. Time spot.
Yeah, the middle of the night, that's when people really come out. You got the German contingent, and people from obviously in England and stuff like that. 5-yard rush guys. I know Britt and I will be on there this year as well. Time TBD, but myself and Britt will be having a time slot on there.
Yeah, it's such and exactly, the Podathon is a lot of fun. And they, a lot of things come up. A lot of, it's cool because you get to not only like be a part of Scott Fish Bowl, or at least hear more about Scott Fish Bowl, but then you have the Podathon. You have everybody talking about what's the important thing there, which is the charitable aspect of this tournament. But you also get to learn a little bit more about the content creators that are taking place in it, and or the fans who are taking place in it. And that's another thing. It's not just for people who like Kevin and myself, who, or the other fantasy football analysts out there. It's for like the general public as well. So, and you'd be surprised who you'd get into your fantasy football division. Like, for example, there's a heavy influence of celebrities, believe it or not, in this tournament. You never know who you're going to get. And I've been fortunate enough that I've had a couple to talk about, 3 individuals that really jump out the past few years. One was, the owner and creator of Underdog Fantasy. I don't know if you've heard of Underdog Fantasy. I hear they do a lot of good things with best ball and fantasy football and all sorts of sports betting, which if you haven't downloaded their app, use their app. Sign up using promo code FRAMES to get your match up to $100. Like what I did there. The next thing was, if you grew up like I did in the 90s, you definitely, it was Fresh Prince of Bel-Air at 8 p.m. And then at 8:30, it was Blossom. And so Mayim Bialik's show, the brother from Blossom, the older brother from Blossom, was in my Scott Fishbowl division a couple of years ago. So it was fun talking Hollywood for him and hearing about his progression in Hollywood. The one that really stands out though is, and I'm kicking myself now that I'm not remembering his name. The drummer from That Thing You Do, Tom Everett Scott.
Oh yeah, Tom Everett Scott. Yep.
Yeah. So I remember like we made this whole big intro where it was just basically That Thing You Do playing in his drum solo. Awesome guy, awesome individual. Just, and the other Fantasy and Frames programs, they've had, Scott Porter, they have Insert, from Friday Night Lights, just a whole bunch of people is what I'm trying to say. It's a lot of fun. You never know who you're going to meet. And again, for content creators, you never know who you're going to meet. So you may, find somebody that is going to help you get your launch in this space or give you advice, or you may be an aspiring actor or actress and you've talked to the right person and you end up in all. I don't know. I'm not promising these things. I'm just saying it's a great melting pot of people who love fantasy football. And you'd be surprised, like, I would never peg you for being a fantasy football person. Well, surprise. Guess what? I am. So it's definitely a lot of fun here. Let's quickly jump to the chat here. We got Mr. Scampers. What's going on, Mr. Scampers? How you doing? Bob Harris, the legendary Bob Harris, football diehard in the chat. What's going on, Bob? We can't wait to see you next hour. And I kind of want to segue a little bit into the next hour before we get into talking more about Scott Fishbowl and the rules that are going on there. So next hour, Stacey Perez, the host of the Fantasy and Frames Draft Show, which you can find Kevin Tompkins also there as well, as long as Erica Brown, Rich Sickles, Keith Fleming. We're going to have a lot of guests. A lot of guests are going to be on the show. I don't want to spoil, the names here, but, Bob Harris may be on the show, as well as a couple other people in the industry, other fellow fantasy football analysts, and they're going to conduct an expert mock draft, and it's going to be a lot of fun. It's always a good time when everybody from the Fantasy Football Draft Show crew is there and available. And you add on all these other people who are joining. It's going to be a great time, 9:00. And so we figured this week on Fantasy Football Weekly, we would kind of give you a little primer in terms of just like, more of the info, the ins and outs of Scott Fishbowl. And so, when it comes to things related to anything fantasy football related, what's the number one rule, Kevin? When it comes to all leagues, rhetorical, of course, know your scoring settings. That is a big part of being a part of a fantasy football league. So let's get into some of these scoring settings right here. Are you able to see that pretty well right there?
Yeah, I got one up too. So,
right,
yeah, it's up there too.
Okay. So it's really cool. There are no negative points. So if you have a fumble or if you have an interception, it doesn't count against you. All touchdowns are 6 points per touchdown, 2 points conversions, 2 points. Makes logical sense there. Here's the thing. Passing yards, normally you would get 0.04 in traditional leagues for a passing yard. Here you get 0.02. So the passing yardage is not as advantageous to you if you're drafting a quarterback who doesn't per se scramble. So these scrambling quarterbacks definitely have a lot more upside. At least that's my take on it versus the high volume passers. But again, nothing to fear. They're where others zig, others can zag and maneuver throughout the draft. In terms of rushing and receiving, 1 point for 10 yards, half a point per first down, 0.25 points per rush attempt. So you get those goal line backs, you get those, very rare and elusive nowadays. Running backs that get majority of the snaps as opposed to coming off the field on third down and having the receiving back come on. Bell cow backs is the expression I'm trying to go with there. Those can come in very handy for you. For receptions, you get, like I said, it's a half PPR for quarterback, kicker, running back, wide receiver, 1 PPR, tight end, 1.5 PPR. Tight ends also get a bonus for an extra point per first down. So you're looking at a 3x potential if a tight end catches a pass for a first down. It is, tight ends. What do we say every year during the season? Oh, tight end is like the fantasy football wasteland position in fantasy. Not here, not Scott Fishbowl.
There's always diamonds in the rough wherever you can find them. They're there.
Right, exactly. Now there is, depending on the platform. So Scott Fishbowl is taking place on 2 different platforms. One is on My Fantasy League, and then others are participating in the tournament on the Sleeper app. And so if you're on Sleeper,
I think you have a choice whether
right?
your league can do either or, but I know all the live drafts, the ones that are drafting in person, are going to be on Sleeper. So you do get a flex spot removed because you have to have a kicker.
Yeah, I totally haven't even got to the starting lineup there, which is going to blow your mind, folks. But it's for those in sleeper leagues, when we get to kicking, it's 3.3 points per made extra point, 0.1 point per field goal. Yes, I participate in my home leagues that have kickers still. That is how we kind of do it, 0.1 points per field goal made. Special teams. Yes, we have special teamers here that if you pick a special teamer on your roster and insert them into your lineup, you get 10 points per return touchdown, 1 point per 5 yards per return. We just throwing everything at you. And so then looking at the big picture, here's your starting lineup each and every week, okay? Especially if you're on sleeper. You are starting definitely 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end, okay? On sleeper, you're starting 1 kicker, 1 super flex, and then 5 flex spots. All right. I believe on MFL you do not have to have a kicker, and you could have 6 flex spots. If that's that right, Kevin? Am I saying that correctly right there?
Yep, exactly.
So good Lord, folks, 5 or 6 flex spots. That's ridiculous. Like, where do you even begin to go? As we have the rules up here right now, when you first saw this, and as you're looking at it now, Kevin, which position just jumps out to you? If you are in, let's say, the beginning of a round. Oh, and there's a 3rd round reversal. I forgot about that. So after the 2nd round, it jumps back to the beginning versus a normal snake draft where it zigs and zags the draft order. Something to pay attention to. So knowing that there is a 3rd round reversal, knowing that there's this plethora of positions to go through, where do you stand if you're somebody who's picking within the first 5 picks of Scott Fishbowl?
I mean, more than likely, it's going to be either a running quarterback or a Christian McCaffrey. That's pretty much been the chalk from the few mocks that I have seen. Now, within the quarterbacks, I mean, we know Superflex, there's the quarterback draft, which is like the draft within a draft. But with this particular scoring, with 1 point per 50 yards, you're getting, an obvious bias to the rushing quarterback. So you're looking at the same guys that you'll be seeing: Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson. But in the mock I did with Optimus Fantasy, Nate Polvo, shout out, by the way, Anthony Richardson went ahead of Patrick Mahomes, which is entirely defensible in this particular format. I think any other format where it's typical, you get, 1 point per 25 yards, you're typically taking Patrick Mahomes. You got to figure he's probably got 4,500 bankable passing yards each season, but it's the rushing upside that really can lift the lid off of. I mean, Jane Daniels went in the 3rd round, and I thought that was very low. And then you've got guys like Kyler Murray that may close out the 1st round. The pocket passers, I believe, after like the first couple tiers, that's where you're going to see them fall. If you are in drafts and you're shocked that you're seeing quarterbacks where they shouldn't be in a super flex, I mean, that's kind of the byproduct of having not just tight end premium, but the bias towards these rushing quarterbacks.
And one of the things I think about when drafting a quarterback in the first 5 or so picks is, like you just said, get your mobile quarterbacks, but don't be afraid to go to other positions. Don't be afraid on the loop back around. Maybe get you're gonna have to reach for a position because of the 3rd round reversal, first of all. So you may not want to get a tight end or a heavily targeted wide receiver, or a bell cow running back at a certain point. The bell cow running back because of the 0.25 per rush attempt, but you may have to, and don't be afraid of that. That may take you out of the running of getting back-to-back dual rushing quarterbacks. But for example, I took part in the Scott Fishbowl mock. I want to say it was last Saturday. I got Daniel Jones in the 10th round, and when he's healthy, he was one of the better rushing quarterbacks, in the league. So don't sleep on Daniel Jones too much. He's a little bit, but not too much. And definitely don't sleep on his ability to scramble and get you those yards there. Or, one of the things that you could also say for quarterback is, yes, your passing yardage may not be there. And no, what I'm about to say is not something I would normally advise because it's such a sticky stat that you can't really go predicting this from year to year. But if you have somebody that on average is giving you, 29 plus touchdowns, very few interceptions, even though the interceptions don't really even matter, right? Is giving you, 30 touchdowns a year, bankable to a certain degree. Touchdowns, offset the passing yardage there as well. So I'm not saying just look at, the list of quarterbacks, how many touchdowns they've thrown the past few years and be like, this is a guarantee. This is not a guarantee. That is not a guarantee. But you want to look at the offense. You want to look at, okay, well, is this going to be a team that has a depressing running back core? Therefore, they're going to be throwing the ball. Is this team project to be a team that's going to be in a real rebuilding mode and therefore has to throw the ball to stay in games or to play catch up? Potentially. Okay, well, then you're leaning towards, both the passing yardage as well as the touchdown upside. So there are ways to get around missing out on a mobile quarterback. But I do want to touch on real quickly this 0.25 per rush attempt for scoring here. There are two players that just jumped out in my mind when I saw this, different positions, and I want to hear your thoughts on both, okay? And, of course, we use the caveat if they're healthy, right? One is more applicable to one than the other. When I saw 0.25 points per rush attempt, my immediate thought was, okay, where's Arthur Smith? He's in Pittsburgh. Najee Harris, boom. Give me all the Najee Harris. Give me all the running backs for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I want the guy who just runs the ball in terms of his coordinating choice there. And then I thought at the wide receiver position, gimme Deebo Samuel. They basically use him as a de facto running back when Christian McCaffrey needs a spell here or there. He's the one I'm more like the when healthy because obviously he's a wide receiver taking on a running back role and getting, absolutely obliterated when he gets tackled, which, kudos to him. Kudos to him as an individual being able to get up and keep doing it. And you don't hear any complaints about him being why do I have to run the ball again? Because he's a baller. That's why. So those are two players that just jumped off the top of my list as far as like you could find in the later rounds that probably are going to be as sexy, but it's the 0.25 points that I think will really add up in terms of their volume, especially Deebo. Especially Deebo, if you can get him in the later rounds. And I want to say by later rounds, I mean like 7 or 8. If he's still not, if he's available at 7 or 8, I'm immediately smashing this position here. What do you think of either of those two players, Kevin?
Well, as far as the Pittsburgh offense, I think that's very safe if you're looking for, just for the rushing attempts parameter on that. You got to figure Pittsburgh is going to be trying to do what they can to kind of hide their quarterback situation behind Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, perhaps even Cordero Patterson too, because he's had familiarity with Arthur Smith from his time with Atlanta. But those guys, I'm trying to see where they went, like in the mock draft that I did. Like Najee Harris went at the 802. I took Jalen Warren in 909. So because of obviously tight end premium, it's going to take some of those wide receivers and running backs down a little bit because of that. And the quarterbacks, that's also going to push down some of those values too. So guys that you don't think about, going where they shouldn't be, but they have to in a super flex because, it's just what happens when positions get pushed down. Yeah, 8th or 9th round, I think that's a pretty good price to pay for either of those guys. And then Deebo, looking at his rushing attempts the last 3 years, 59, 42, and 37, at least 225 yards in each of those last 3 seasons as well. So, I mean, not only are you getting, how many targets, 85 to 95 targets for Deebo the last couple of years, you're also getting, the rushing component that helps mitigate some of that. Maybe if he's not getting the counting stats targets, receptions wise, we know that's an efficient offense. He's probably going to score between as how if healthy, of course. 6 to 8, 9, 10 touchdowns. So yeah, Debo's definitely a great value there. If you're trying to get some kind of edge, look toward the teams that are kind of running that Shanahan, the motion. We know Puka Nacua is always good for a few rushes here and there too. Cooper Kupp, if he's healthy, you look at guys like Jaden Reed as well, with rushing upside. So those are guys too that, if you're trying to maybe break a tie, I don't think you're going to go out and saying, oh, I only need guys that are going to be getting 15 rushes per season. Right. That's kind of foolhardy, but also using those guys to maybe break ties between, do I want to take a Jaden Reed or a Deontay Johnson, who is strictly, target earning on a less than ideal offense. I'm going to be taking a guy like Jaden Reed just because I know what he can offer. And also the Green Bay Packers offense should be, obviously an ascending offense, much more efficient as well.
Another name I want to throw in there, Rondale Moore. Last year, he was second amongst all wide receivers in rushing. Yes, he has a different, home this year, but, you read about all the reports here out of Atlanta that they plan on having him have a major role here. So, Najee Harris or Tyler Algier need a spell. Again, somebody in the later rounds of your draft, like look for the versatility, look for the advantages where you can. Okay, so we talked about the early part of your draft, right? Where you're picking in the first round. So now let's move towards like the middle to later rounds of your draft. Okay, more than likely, all the high-profile rushing quarterbacks are off the market. Now you're looking at high-end wide receivers and/or start filling in your tight end spot. And the rounds are going to be looping back around, so you'll have essentially close to as close to double back-to-back picks as possible. Let me ask you a question. Is it crazy to go elite tight end to start your draft if you're in the back end of that round just to play that bully tight end strategy? Or is that something that's a little bit too risque and you might want to go for mixing it up in terms of diversifying one's portfolio here?
For taking that tight end, I think you can certainly make a case for it. I still do want to at least get a quarterback. If I'm saying I'm at the 111, it's hard for me to pass up a guy like Kyler Murray, who I know obviously the Cardinals have put up, are going to be putting up some numbers this year, you'd think, with Trey McBride, with Marvin Harrison, with guys like that. So I think they're going to be throwing a lot more. We know Kyler Murray has rushing upside certainly as well. So it's going to be hard to not click that, but I would totally that's the great thing about Scott Fishbowl is that every draft is different. So right. You might see Sam Laporta go 106 just to kind of shake things up, but you also might get tight ends to fall. Like you can't just see one draft and go, this is how it's going to go, because it's not how it's going to go. I almost guarantee you. So, right. In the draft that I did on Monday, Sam Laporta, the first tight end, was off the board at 204. So, and that started 5 tight ends, ending with Kyle Pitts at the 212. So, seeing that. It's very hard to go tight end unless you have one of those 110, 111, 112. I think if you don't get a tight end, if you don't get a quarterback that you want to fall there, because you'll see guys like Bijan, guys like Breece Hall, Tyreek Hill, you'll see those guys come off the board in some form or fashion. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey will probably go in the first 5-6 picks. If a lot of those guys are off the board and you don't have a quarterback that you want, I would pull the trigger on Sam Laporta, Travis Kelce, or even because of how grouped together tight end is. Because I did an article about kind of the tight end position with Sam Laporta, that I don't think he should be the tight end 1 because everybody is so grouped together with him, Kelce, Trey McBride, Mark Andrews, even Kyle Pitts, even George Kittle. Maybe not so much George Kittle and Kyle Pitts, but you can certainly make a case for the top 3 to be kind of interchangeable. So if you gave me a choice of those 3 tight ends, I'm taking Kelce and I'm taking Trey McBride over Sam Laporta. And if I had the 111, I had the 104, so I'm not going to be in play for it. But if the quarterbacks that I want are off the board, give me Kelce, McBride, and I'll figure out quarterback later.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you're doing that because I have the 103 and I'm also going tight end, or excuse me, I'm going tight end with my first 3 picks. I want to get Travis Kelce. I want to be able to, obviously there's the. Let me back up. Let me back up for a second. Right now, as I'm talking to you on June 13th, 8:37 p.m. Eastern, I want to go and get my elite tight end off the board and compensate for the lack of rushing upside at the quarterback position by getting as many high passing volume to quarterbacks as possible. I want to go skill position. I want to really maximize this whole half a point for first down, 0.25 per rush attempt, and point for 10 yards. But I say that now, and many of you may say now, like, well, yeah, I got my strategy, figured out. I know how I want to approach this. I've done a few mocks. I'm good. My friend or friends, you're never good. And whatever your strategy is now on June 13th at 8:38 p.m., I guarantee you by the time your draft starts, it is out the window in the trash can, and you have gone through so many iterations. And, if knowing your scoring settings is the number one rule for all of fantasy football, and no matter what league you're in, the second one I would say is don't pigeonhole yourself to a particular strategy, because you never know how your draft is going to play out. You never know the circumstances. You never know who you're playing with. You could be playing with sharks. You could be playing with novices, and you're probably playing more than likely somewhere in between. And you know what? The whole playing with novices thing I want to get to really quickly. Don't assume because they're not an analyst that you're not going to get your butt handed to you versus a novice. You know what I mean? These tournaments, this Scott Fishbowl tournament, every year they make up these different scoring settings for a reason, to give everybody an equally competitive advantage in how they assemble their roster. So don't be arrogant, if you're out there thinking, oh, I got this in the bag. No, you don't. More than likely you don't. I'd like to go back the past 5 years and look at how many people who actually have won Scott Fishbowl were analysts versus non-analysts. And I would say that you would see a shift towards the non-analysts winning Scott Fishbowl. So keep those egos in check out there, folks. But it is, there's so many ways to do this, man. Mr. Scampers, I love what you just put in the chat on Mark Andrews tight end 1. That is not what I love. Let's go here. If I've learned anything, mocks for Scott Fishbowl are useless. Sorry, content creators. And I believe what Mr. Scampers forgot to put in his comment is, but I'll see you next hour for our Scott Fishbowl mock draft that we'll be having with a bunch of stars here and there. You like to watch it, look, we had Scott Fish on, Jeremy Noble and myself on Saturday night, and we had Zach's, aka FF Chalupa Batman, and they both said flat out, it is hard for me to do mock drafts. It is hard for me to do mock drafts, and it's hard for me to take away the biases that I might have, and how the skewing that I might be, not the biases, but the biases I may have towards how I'm approaching a draft, being locked into a strategy. For some people, they don't work, but you know what they do? They make for great viewing. So for those who are out there, which by the way, thank you very much for all of you who are out there, especially on our YouTube. If you have not yet liked and subscribed to the Fantasy and Frames channel, please make sure to do so, and make sure to hit that notification bell wherever you are. That way, whenever we drop great content here at Fantasy and Frames, you are notified. And of course, thanks to everybody on X who is watching currently. Mr. Scampers here with a good save. Exactly. They are so much fun to watch. There you go. That's what we want to see, Mr. Scampers. I love it. Kevin, 5 to 6 super flex spots. Is that insane to you? When you saw that, your immediate reaction, what was it?
I can only draft like 2 running backs. I'm happy, honestly. So I run a dynasty league, which is positionless. So this is very close to that. My dynasty that I run is 1 quarterback, 8 flexes, and a super flex. So I am very much used to just it allows for so many different roster builds with having go positionless. If I only need to start 1 running back, I'm drafting 3 maximum. That's what's great about it. And I think a big hole, and when people see the scoring, they'll automatically assume, well, wide receivers are nerfed. okay, well, if people are going to be taking Kelsey McBride, Andrews, Laporta in like the second round, then I can mitigate that by drafting multiple 150 target earning wide receivers. Health, of course, being the factor there. But, if I can fit all those guys in my flex, I have an immediate advantage over everybody else. And if I can find a running back that, we didn't touch on this, but this is the biggest edge post like round 10 in Scott Fishbowl is the return TD, return yardage, because there are a lot of players that are relevant in fantasy with a lot of overlap into the return game. I'm going to go through the list. Khalil Shakir, Cordero Patterson, Tajay Spears, Josh Downs, Marvin Mims, guys like that. Rashid Shaheed is a big one. Guys, Bucky Irving is slated to be Tampa's kickoff returner. Guys that have overlap with not just fantasy value, but return value with the return rule changes this season. I think those guys have immense shots if they hold that position all year round to be top 50 overall scorers, especially if they retain their role on offense. If, Bucky Irving is certainly a contingent play on Rachaad White, but all those guys I listed should at the very least be pretty involved in their offenses. Certainly Tajay Spears as well, even with Tony Pollard there. But those are guys that I'm looking at to where they may fall by the wayside to some people when people, and understandable too, when people just think, oh, well, we don't know their role on offense. I would much rather have Ezekiel Elliott, who I know is, could be ticketed for 150 carries in that, and that certainly has merit, and that certainly has a lot of value in it within itself because of the rushing attempt scoring. But if I can get those guys that serve a dual purpose, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. Remember the old Draft with Giants leagues from Expand the Box a couple years ago? The expandtheboxscore.com. I forget who ran those, but they also had kickoff return usage points in those. Wow. They're best ball. They're on MFL. But it was like one of the community. It was like a Scott Fishbowl.
Okay.
Yeah. So they used to have return yardage. So that was the big kind of edge you could get on people drafting guys that solely are returns. But like you could draft Andre Roberts, and he would be like a top 30 wide receiver at minimum solely on return yardage. Nyheim Hines is another one that when he was with the Colts, he was their primary kickoff returner. So, guys like that, Tajay Spears, Khalil Shakir, Rashid Shaheed are big ones for me as guys that can serve a dual purpose and be kind of under the radar when drafts are going.
So Anne has a question in the chat here, and she's like, "But where do you need to take those guys?" And my immediate reaction, and I'm not trying to be a smartass, which is a rare thing because normally I do try to be a smartass here, is like, when things seem the most desperate, when you have your people in your roster, your starting roster, and you have some depth pieces there, and you're just like, man, where do I go from here? The minute you have that thought bubble pop up, that's where you start looking.
That's where you start that's where you start having those guys in mind and take those guys, because if I don't draft to fill the positions and then go for bench. I will draft. God, I'm an ideological drafter to the extreme. I will draft 7 wide receivers in the first 10 rounds and call it a day. But, if I can get Tajay Spears as my RB1, and I know that sounds gross to a lot of people, but how gross is that when you're getting return yardage, obvious use in the offense? I mean, right. That sounds like a top 18-ish running back, just baseline with the return yardage. And then you add on if he can take the job from Tony Pollard. I don't think he has top 3 upside, but he has top 10 upside. And you can get him in like the 11th, 12th round. I mean, I'm looking at he went in the 10th round in this mock. And I'm not sure, a lot of people aren't thinking about that return yardage because they haven't ever really had to think about that unless they're poring over the rules and make a note of it. I don't think a lot of people are kind of hip to that. So I think that's where you can find an edge is with those specific, that kind of pool of players. And I know, and it's very difficult with teams that I know some like to use cornerbacks, and those guys aren't going to be able to be drafted. Like I know the Packers have Keyshawn Nixon, and he's a cornerback. He's not able to be drafted, but players on offense, that you can draft. Cordero Patterson's probably is a big one too. He is very cognizant of the return. He's one of the best returners of our, the last decade or so. And he knows the rules. He's made a career out of being, an absolute unit in the return game. But there's also places for guys that maybe they don't have a role on offense, but are such good returners, like a Kevontae Turpin for the Dallas Cowboys. Let me look at some other guys. Trey Tucker, who, if he could find a deep threat role in the Raiders, can add the kickoff return element with that. Dameon Pierce, who, the Texans are kind of we know they have Joe Mixon, but Dameon Pierce has really fallen off the last year or so, and that could be an interesting kind of backfield where he might be the contingent guy, but at the very least, he's providing kickoff return points. Nyheim Hines, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I apologize for this next recommendation because I know Stacey Perez is a huge fan. Marvin Mims, assuming that he doesn't get out of Sean Payton's doghouse, jumps off the brain here. Yeah. Calvin, who was I going to say? Calvin Austin for Pittsburgh. Like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot out there, man. It's
Braxton Berrios, another one.
Braxton Berrios, yeah. And what's really crazy is like you ask yourself, well, like how high of an upside could I get with these, return players or these special teamers? Like, well, Rashid Shaheed was, I believe, Scott Fish announced was top 5 in scoring using these rules this year from the stats from last year. So pretty freaking high if you nail the right one here. And they have a sure path to opportunity. Mr. Scamper's here. I'm still calling it. Tyreek, and to a lesser extent, Jalen Waddle will break this tournament if Miami uses them correctly for returns.
I'd be worried, honestly, with the health issues that both of those guys have had the last season or two. I would be very wary knowing the new kickoff return rules if they put him back there. I know our lads right now has Braxton Berrios slated for both kickoff and punt return. And who thought we would be getting this in depth about kickoff and punt return, depth charts on June 13th. But here we are talking about Scott Fish Bowl because that's what's important. That's where you can get your edge. But yeah, I'd be worried about Tyreek and Jalen Waddle being able to take extra hits, knowing their importance in the offense and knowing how much of a target share those two combine for. If they're out there, you're getting extra stuff. But I'm not expecting either guy to be there, though. Obviously, we know Tyreek can certainly do that.
I think back to like the days like when I first started playing fantasy football, and it's like, why did you draft their player? Why did you draft this player? And I didn't say because their rushing volume, their yards after contact per attempt, their yards per route run. I didn't throw out any metrics. My initial, non-analytical self here was like, they're a good football player, and I want them on my team. This is a tournament where you'd be like, why do you want these players on your roster? Because they're good fucking football players. And they could do special teams. They could play roles in the rushing and the receiving game. I mean, you name it.
Fantasy doesn't have to be hard.
It doesn't. It really doesn't.
Player.
And no disrespect to people out there, but like, yes, there is a lot of luck that comes into play when it's like, you can look at trends and patterns of efficiency, so on and so forth, all you want. And a large majority of the time, a large percentage of the time, don't quote me on what the percentage is, but like you're heading down the right direction towards success. Okay.
Right.
But that's not the be all end all. Sometimes things just go your way. And I think as we wrap up the show, as we get ready to go into the Shark Tank here with Stacey Perez on the special edition of the Fantasy Frames Draft Show is, don't do the whole analysis by paralysis thing if you can avoid it. This is, Mr. Scampers in the chat earlier and several other people I've talked to have said, I don't like doing mocks. Well, one of the reasons I like doing mock drafts is that I get all the paralysis by analysis situations out of my head, already by doing all these mock drafts where I'm just like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I do? By the time my draft comes around, it's like, okay, well, I've basically gone through every permutation possible in my head as far as like how I would approach a draft. And even then it's probably not enough, but at least I've gotten the jitters and the butterflies out of my head as far as participating in a mock that people are taking seriously. And it I don't know, just it calms me down when the real thing is on the line. And let's not forget, a lot of the mock drafts that we have going on, whether here at Fantasy and Frames or where you're ever you're watching your mock draft content, hopefully it's at Fantasy and Frames, wink, nudge, nudge. We're using 2-minute timers, 1-minute timers. Like Scott Fishbowl, you have I believe it's an 8-hour timer per pick, right? So there's not that like crazy rush where you have to be like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I'm going to freak out. Like, no, you got time. You got some time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm gonna try that in the Minneapolis live draft. I'm gonna see if I can squeeze out 8 hours before my first pick. And
except for live drafts. Excuse me. Yeah, good call.
Scott will be like, Ian's got to go to bed. Like, Kevin, make a pick, please. We'll take the rest on sleeper, but just make a pick, dude.
So that's gonna wrap up, I think, our little discussion here on Scott Fishbowl 14 rules and scoring, and just our thoughts on. Whether it's, where you're picking in the first round, where you're picking in your drafts, the advantages of the special teamers. I talked to Scott the other day and I'm like, so is there a way we can get IDP and Scott Fishbowl? Which immediately the answer was no. And I get it. It's such a small percentage of the fantasy community. I get it. I love it. That's why I talk about it.
I'd be good with one. I'd be good with like a player.
Right. Yeah. But here's the thing. Like, you had mentioned it a little bit earlier, like, cornerbacks. There are cornerbacks that have dual purposes of being kickoff return. Like this could be a situation where we could finally get an IDP player in Scott Fishbowl because they would be punt return or kickoff return eligible. Right. And it's like, I don't care how they did it. They managed to get IDP into Scott Fishbowl. At least that could be the victory cry right there.
There you go.
But I digress. Mr. Scampers, you are awesome as always. Thanks as always. See you in a few. Folks, that's going to wrap it up here on Fantasy Football Weekly. Next week, we'll have Keith back. We'll have Britt back. Wishing you both well. And, everybody who tunes in every week for Fantasy Football Weekly, we really appreciate it. But gear up. Take your 5 minutes that you have now. Get your drinks. Get your popcorn. Get your dinner. Whatever it is you're doing right now, just find a seat. Get comfortable. Because the Fantasy Football Draft Show is next with host Stacey Perez and company. They're going to have a lot of guests on here. We're going to be doing a Scott Fishbowl mock. It is going to be fantastic because you're also not only just going to be watching a mock draft, but these people are going to do a fantastic job of giving you their thought processes as the draft is going on. So that way, if you're having some issues in your draft and your mock drafts are not coming out the way you like them to, hey, you know what? You're going to learn some stuff. You're going to learn a lot of stuff. So stay tuned for that. So Kevin, man, as always, it's been great. Anything you want to talk about that you're working on or share in general as we do every single week here on Fantasy Football Weekly?
I think we're good. I'm just excited to do this mock draft, not gonna lie. I'm excited to get back in there with everybody, razz Bob Harris as much as I can before we sit next to each other in Canton for the Jim Brown auction. So I'm trying to snipe his players now so he can already get mad at me for then. That's basically my aim for tonight, as well as drafting a good team.
There you go. That works. For me, it's don't forget to check. Yeah, exactly. It's all love. Don't forget to check out. We dropped a bunch of articles from a bunch of different analysts here at Fantasy and Frames over at fantasyinframes.com. Don't forget to check that out. One of our longtime analysts here, Tyler Heil, he's riding off into the sunset this week. He is moving out of the content creation space, and I just want to give him a personal shout out because this guy, has been one of the hardest working people I've known in the space for years, has just done so much for Fantasy and Frames, is a good friend. And I think that's the ultimate thing to take away from all this is no matter what we all do, where we all go here from now, next year, next month, so on and so forth, is to come away from your experiences in the fantasy football community with more friendships than you had going into it. And so I will always be thankful for Tyler, most importantly for his friendship. So thank you very much for that. And then, of course, let's go Celtics. One more game to go. Love it. Love the
I don't have a broom here, but I think that's imminent.
Yeah, I hope so. All right, folks, gear up for Fantasy Football Draft Show next. And for Kevin, I'm Jorge. We will see you next week.